Okay, hello everyone. Okay, so the next program in chapter 4 is budget analysis. All right, so write a program that asks a user to enter the amount that he or she has budgeted for the month. A loop should then prompt the user to enter each of his or her expenses for the month and keep a running total. So when the loop finishes, the program should display the amounts that the user is over or under budget. So basically, the program is going to ask the user to enter how much he or she has budgeted for the month. And it's going to keep asking the user for how much they spent on each of the expenses. So it's going to keep a running total of the expenses. So if they bought, let's say, an iPhone for $500, or let's say food for $100, they're going to type all the expenses, how much they spent on all the expenses. The program is going to add them all up as it's asking the user to type the expenses. And at the end of the day, it's going to say how much the user was over or under budget. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So the program starts by saying we should ask the user to enter the amount that he or she has budgeted for the month. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's ask the user for how much he or she has budgeted for the month. Okay, so to do that, we need to go ahead and type the input function, or use the input function. We are going to use the input function to ask the user how much they've budgeted for the month. So we're going to say, please enter how much you have budgeted for the month. Okay, so now the input function basically it's going to ask the user a question, and it's going to allow the user to enter a response. Okay, and so the user is going to type in something. Now, the input function always returns a string. Whatever the user types is going to be returned as a string. But the thing is, it's going to return a string. Okay, if the user in this case, the user is going to type in a number. It's going to type in the user is going to type in the amount that they budgeted for the month. So it's going to be a monetary value. It's going to be, say, $5,000 or $100,000. It could be a number. But the input function by default returns a string. Okay, so the thing is, we cannot use strings in calculations, or we cannot use strings in the way that we want to use it in this program. We have to find a way to convert the string that is being returned from the input function to a number so we can use it, right? So the user is going to type in a number. It's going to be returned as a string. We have to go ahead and convert whatever the user has typed into a float, because the user can type in, for example, $100.50, 100.50. So because of that, we want to convert whatever the user has typed into a float, okay, first. So I'm going to do that, I'm going to type the float function and surround everything that the user has typed into in parentheses. Basically, the float function is going to convert everything that the user has typed, okay, everything highlighted here, everything that the user has typed. Okay, I'm using the input function, of course. So it's going to convert everything that the user has typed, or what the input function is returning, which is what the user has typed. It's going to convert it into a float. And once it does that, we need a place to store it, right? So I'm going to go ahead and create a variable. And whatever is being returned, whatever is being converted to a float, is going to be the user's budget for a month. Okay, not for a month. Let's just say it's actually for a month, but let's just say that's the user's budget. So I'm going to create a variable called user budget here, which is going to store what the user has typed converted to a float. Now, this line over here is a guideline for me to not exceed 80 characters on a line. I want to try to restrict 80 characters on a line. I want to stay within 80 characters on a line. So it's a Python standard to keep 80 characters on a line. So I'm going to break this line. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the string and concatenate it with the beginning of this string. Now I have two strings being concatenated together, and I'm going to break it here. But before you break any line in Python, you have to type the backslash, and then you hit enter or break it. So now I will have the user's budget stored here in user budget, basically. And then the program says over here, the program says a loop should then prompt the user to enter each of his or her expenses for the month, okay, and keep a running total. All right, so first of all, I'm going to create a variable called more expenses, okay? And I'm going to set more expenses is going to be basically a string, right? So I'm going to set it to y. Initially, I'm going to set it to y. Should I set it to y? I'll set it to a string. I'll set it to y as a string. Okay, no semicolon. I'll set it to a string y, okay? And the program said we should use a loop, okay, to prompt the user to enter each of his or her expenses for the month and keep a running total. Right, so before I do that also, I'm going to go ahead and I'll do that later. So more expenses is going to be y, okay? I'm going to go ahead and create a while loop. I'm going to go ahead and create a while loop over here and say while more expenses, okay, is equal to, I'm using double equals to compare. I'm using double equals to compare by saying is y what is stored in more expenses. Now if I do one equal sign, I'm assigning what's on the right to what's on the left. I don't want to. This is basically reading while you were able to assign y to more expenses. I don't want that. I want to compare what's on the right to what's on the left. So I'm saying while what's on the right, in this case y is equal to, it's equivalent to, or is the same as what's in more expenses, then do what's in the loop basically. So while more expenses is equal to y, now initially more expenses is equal to y. So that means this loop, whatever is in this loop is going to run. While more expenses is equal to y, I want to go ahead and ask the user to enter an expense. So I'm going to go ahead and create an input function like we did up here. Input function, sorry, not equal to. Input function, I'm going to ask the user to enter an expense. And then allow them to type, okay? Now when they type in a value, again, the input function always by default, so no semicolon. I keep on typing the semicolon. In Java, we terminate statements with semicolons. Over here, I'm not going to. It's not really, I don't do that. So no semicolon. So enter an expense, okay? Now we know that by default, the input function always returns a string. But we don't need a string in this case. We want a monetary value. The user is going to type in an expense, a real monetary value, like let's say $50 or something. But because by default the input function returns a string, we have to go ahead and convert it to a float, like we did here. You have to go ahead and convert everything the user has typed into a float here. And once we've been able to convert it into a float, we need a place to store it. Now that's going to be an expense, or basically user expense. So I'm going to create a variable called user expense to store the expense that the user has typed, okay? And then I want to keep track of the user's total expenses, right? So I'm going to create a variable here, and I'm going to, let's see. I'm going to create a variable up here, and I'm going to name it total expenses. And I want total expenses to keep track of all basically each expense all added up. Okay, so if you made, let's say, $50, you bought, let's say, $50 of stuff. Again, you bought, let's say, $100 of worth of all the stuff. Basically, keep track of all the expenses, add them all together. Let this variable total expenses keep track of it as you're asking the user to type in your expenses. Initially, when the program starts, total expenses is going to be 0, so I'm going to initialize it to 0. Okay. So anytime you get an expense, anytime the user types in an expense, I want you to add it up to total expenses. So now the user is going to type in an expense here, and I'm going to basically add it up to total expenses. So total expenses over here is going to be equal to, it's going to be equal to what's already stored in total expenses, okay, plus the user expense. No semicolon. Keep on typing semicolons. All right. So once the user types in an expense, I am adding up the expense to total expenses and then storing the results of this addition to total expenses. Now, initially, total expenses is 0. So the first time this loop runs, if the user types in the user expense, it's going to, for example, if the user types in $50, I'm adding $50 to 0, which gives me 50, and I'm storing 50 in total expenses. If the user says there are more expenses and comes back again, and now we know total expenses is 50. If the user types in again, let's say another 100, now we are adding 100 to 50, which results to 150, and we are storing the 150 in total expenses. So we are accumulating the user's total expenses. Now this can be written as this can be written in a short version as total expenses plus equals user expense, meaning what we are adding, okay, to total expenses is user expense. Okay, what we are adding to total expenses is user expense. Okay, I'm adding user expense to total expenses. You can read it like that if it helps. So after I've accepted the user expense from the user, and I've added it up to the total expenses, I want to go ahead and ask the user again if they have an expense. So I am going to ask the user, okay, if they have an expense. So I'm going to call input function to ask the user that question. No semicolon again. Okay, so I'm going to say more expenses. I'm going to ask, do you have more expenses? Do you have more expenses? Here. So do you have more expenses? And then I'm going to give them a chance to type in something, right? This time I'm only expecting a string. I'm not expecting a float, so I don't have to convert it using the float function. I'm expecting a string. So I want to get the response, and I want to store a response in the variable more expenses here. So if the user types in, I'm going to say, let me just give them a hint and say Y for yes. Type Y for yes. Y for yes. Okay. Sorry. I'm going to break, I'll say type Y for yes, N for no. Now because I've exceeded this line, I want to break it, so I'm going to close the string here, concatenate it with the beginning of the string, and break it. Before I break it, I have to type the backslash and hit enter. So I've broken it here. So do you have more expenses? Type Y for yes, N for no, or basically any key for no. Any key any key for no. And now this is exceeding it, so instead of breaking it there, I'll break it somewhere here. Close the string, open another string, concatenate them. Before I break it, I type backslash and hit enter, and then I'll put this together like this. So you have more expenses, type Y for yes, any key for no. And guess what? If the user types Y is going to be stored in more expenses, and it's going to come back up to the loop here, and it's going to ask, is more expenses equal to Y? Now, if more expenses is equal to Y, then that means the user had more expenses. So ask the user to enter an expense, and then do the following, and ask the user again, do you have more expenses? If the user types in no, it's going to come back up and check, is more expenses equal to Y? Now, if the user types in N or any key, that key wouldn't be equal to Y, so this loop wouldn't run. So that means the user is done. Okay, so once we're done with this while loop, what we want to do is we want to check to see if the user exceeded their budget or were below their budget. So I'm going to go ahead and create an if statement and say if, let's see, I'm going to say if the total, but by the time this loop is done, we're going to have the total expenses here, right? And we have the user's budget also here. So we're going to say if the, let's see, we're going to say if the user's expense, okay, which is total expenses, we can name this user total expenses. Okay, we can do that. Actually, let's do that. User total expenses, and this is also user total expenses. User expense. Okay, all right. So if total expenses, okay, is greater than the user budget. Okay, so if that means if the user exceeded the budget, if the total expenses is greater than user budget, then we want to go ahead and display that they were over budget by how much, and we're going to calculate it. Then we want to go ahead and display. So I'm going to pass in a couple of arguments into the print function. So I'm going to say you were over budget. I'm going to say you were over your, and the thing is, I'm going to even go ahead and since I have the budget here, the user's budget stored in user budget, I can go ahead and use it. So I'm going to say you were over your, I'm going to pass in the next argument, which is the user budget. Your user budget here, you're over your, and it's going to store the value. User budget is going to store the value in, basically the budget in user budget. So you're over your user budget, okay, and then budget. This is just a string. By, let's see, if you're over your user budget, I'm going to say you're over your budget, okay, your budget off, and this is going to be the budget, and I'm going to say by, and then we want to calculate how much they're over by. Now, if their total expenses was more than, let's say, was more than the user budget, then to get how much they're over the budget, we have to subtract the user budget from the total expenses, right? So it's going to be total expenses minus the user budget, and that's going to give us how much they were over their user budget. Now, because this is exceeding the line, I'm going to break it here by typing the backslash and hit enter. All right, so what if the total expenses was not over the user budget? Then that means it's possible the user budget was over was actually more than the total expenses. In that case, they were under budget. Or it's possible the total expenses was equal to the user budget. In that case, they were on budget. Basically, they met their budget. They used exactly the budget. So I'm going to call the elif clause. Okay, I'll write the elif clause. Type the elif clause. So elif the total expenses. Let me just switch it all around. If the user budget was greater than the total expenses. Okay, so meaning that if the user budget was greater than the total expenses, meaning meaning if the user was under budget, if the user used less than the user budget, then this time around we want to print something different. So I'm going to copy this line and say you were not over but under your budget of user budget by. Now, if we wanted to know how much they were under budget, since they used less than the total expenses, again we have to subtract. It's the same thing. We have to subtract the the total expenses. Now this time around we are subtracting. Actually, it's the other way around. Pretty much, this is the other way around. So if they were under the budget, to get how much they were under budget, we have to subtract the total expenses, okay, from the user budget. And did I do this the first one right? Let me see. So if the total expenses was over the user budget, I mean they were over it, right? So we have to subtract the user budget, yes, from the total expenses to get how much they were over. Yeah, we have to subtract the user budget from the total expenses to get how much they were over. Okay, all right. And over here, if their user budget was greater than the total expenses, meaning if they use less than the budget, right? Then to get how much they were under budget, we have to subtract the total expenses from the user budget. Then we'll know that. So it's going to be the other way around. User budget minus total expenses. Now we'll format this value later on. Okay. Now if the total expenses is not greater than the user budget, okay, and the user budget is not greater than the total expenses, then else, okay, then they use exactly the expenses. They use exactly, if the expenses was $1,000, then they use $1,000. So in that case, we want to print you used exactly your budget of. We're going to pass in the user budget. Use exactly your budget of user budget. So that's it. Basically that's it. And I can just pass in just a period as the next argument. So by default, not by default, pretty much. So Actually, by default, yeah. When you use the print function and you pass in arguments this way, these arguments are separated by a space when they're printed. So it's going to print you were over your budget of space. User budgets, the value of it, space, by space, the result of total expenses minus user budgets. That's what's going to be printed. And the same thing for all of these. Okay, so now we're done. Let's go ahead and run this program, and then let me save it first and then see what happens. So I'm going to save it where I save all the Python files, and I'm going to go to the next step. And this program is what? Budget analysis. So I'm going to create a folder first. Budget analysis. And budget analysis here. Oh, .py. So let's see what happens. Okay, so please enter how much you've budgeted for the month. I need to space it out. You budgeted for the month. Okay. Now we will format these values. Okay, we'll format it. But before that, let's just run it and see what happens. How much you've budgeted for the month? I'm going to say $1,000. Please enter an expense. I'm going to say $100. I use $100. Do you have more expenses? I'm going to type in. I'm supposed to put a colon, so let me just do that. Just make it. I'll just let me run the program and then I'll do it after. So I'm going to type in Y, enter an expense. Another $100. Yes, another $100. Yes, another $100. Now I'm going to hit no. I know I've used $400, so I'm under budget $600. That's what I'm expecting. Because I budgeted for $1,000, I use only $400, so now I'm under budget. I have $600 more left to use. So I'm going to hit no and hit enter. Okay, so we have a problem. His built-in name total expenses is not defined. Okay, so let me stop this. So I named it as, remember I changed it to user total expenses. I changed it to user total expenses, so I need to, this has to match. There's nothing like total expenses over here. It's user total expenses because I changed it. So I'm going to change this to user total expenses here. Same thing for this one. And same thing here. And where else? I think that's good. And now that I am here, why don't I format it? Let's see how it looks first. And then, so 1,000, I used 400. Yes, 400. Oops, let's not do that. Let me just put a colon here. You have more expenses here. Okay. So now let's try. I put 1,000 and then I enter an expense. 100. Yes, 100. So basically I used $400. When I hit enter, I used $400. I budget for 1,000. I'm expecting $600 under budget, right? So type Wi-Fi. So I'm going to type no this time around and hit enter. Okay, again. It says user total expenses is not defined. How did I define this thing? User total. Okay, I made this a small letter T. And then I used, so let me, yeah, I made this a small letter T. So now these ones are capital T. So now they should work. Now they should work. All right. So 1,000, 100. Oops. All right. All right. So again, name user total expenses is not defined. Where is it? Up here. Up here, I forgot to change it to capital T as well. All right, so 1,000, enter an expense, 100. Yes, 100. Yes, 100. So 400, I'm expecting 600, right? So no. And you were under your budget of 1,000 by 600. So now what's left is we have to format it, right? Let's go ahead and format it and then test the rest. So this is the value we want to format, right? This is the value we want to format. Basically this, actually all of this. Basically this. Okay, all the values. Let's see. We can format a couple of things together. Let's see. So since I don't want to call the format function twice, I mean here we don't want to do that. So I'm going to format these two together like this, and basically all this together. Let's call the format function here. So you were over your budget of. So now the first thing I want to format is, let's see. Now what I want to format is the budget first, which is user. Where is it? User budget. That's what I want to format first. It's hiding somewhere on the top. Okay. You under your budget of user budget, and also the other thing I want to, let me see. I've never tried actually. Let me see something here. User budget and hold on one second. Let me just try something here. I want to see something. User budget, and let's try another, which is user total expenses. Let's try something here really quickly. And let's try percentage $. I'll explain this in a second. I just want to try something. Okay, let's try this and see. It should give me an error. Okay, no errors. Let's see. Maybe it's going to give us an error soon. So 100. No. Okay, so it works. Actually, it's not necessarily working. This is your under. Let's try over. Yeah, it wasn't working. Okay, so now so it takes 2 arguments and not 3 arguments. So I was looking at that. All right, so that means you have to call the format. We can use other ways to format it, but let me see something here. All right. Okay, it's fine. Let's just go ahead and call the format function a couple of times. But we can use other ways to format it. Let's just do it this way for now. All right. So I'm taking it back to how it was. All right. So this is how it was. So let's go ahead and format the user budget. So I'm going to call the format function surrounded around the user budget, and take this back, take this down. we are formatting these values individually. But then there's a way to format it together, okay? Without calling the format function a couple of times. So I'm going to just format. I'm actually going to just format these two, okay? And then you can apply it to the rest. And I'll explain these two just so we don't, I use it all the time. But I'm going to format it a couple of times, and then you apply the same way, Oh, you know what? I'll just do it. I'll do it. So we are formatting the user budget. The format function takes 2 arguments with what you want to format and how you want to specify it, or how you want to format it. So in this case, I'm formatting the user budget. I want to format it. This is how I'm going to specify how I want it formatted. So I'm formatting the user budget. First of all, the user budget is a float, so I'm going to type an F, and I want it formatted to 2 decimal places, right? So it's a float. I'm formatting it as a float. I'm formatting it to 2 decimal places. So I'm putting the precision right in front of the F, right in front of the type. So 0.2. If I wanted to format it to 3 decimal places, I would say 0.3. But I'm formatting it to 2 decimal places, and I'm also going to put a comma in front of them. And the comma is basically going to put commas where necessary. It's going to put a comma for example, if the user budget is, let's say, $10,000, it's going to put 10,000,000. If it was $1 million, it was going to automatically put commas, for example, in 1,000,000,000. It's going to know where to put the comma. It's going to put it in the value automatically. Separate, 3 zeros by commas, stuff like that. It's going to do that automatically. So, and I want to basically precede it with a $sign. So I'm going to put a $sign here. And it's going to round that. Format that and round it to 2 decimal places. I'm going to do the same thing for this. Okay, so format, but I'm formatting the whole of this. Okay, I'm formatting the whole. So this is the value that I want to format here. Okay, this is the value I want to format, and how I want it formatted is exactly the same way. I want it formatted as a float. As a float, yeah, formatted to 2 decimal places. Put commas where necessary, and put a $sign in front of the value here. Okay, so the format function takes in 2 arguments. What you want to format, in this case, this, comma, the second argument is how you want it formatted. Commas where necessary, precision is to point 2 decimal places, formatting it as a float, and you're putting a $sign in front of it, just in front of it, before the output of the format, or because before the format function returns anything. I'm going to do the same thing, but I'll break this here on a line. I'll break it here. Before I break it, I type in a backslash and hit enter. Space this out a little bit, and I'll join this to that. I don't need a slash now. I'm going to go ahead and format this also quickly, and the same way as a float, 2 decimal places, commas where necessary, and put a $sign in front of it. Do the same thing for this one. I'm formatting the results of this difference or the subtraction, and I'm formatting it the same way, comma, 0.2f. Put in the $sign in front of them here, and I'm breaking it somewhere here. Before I break it, I'm going to type the backslash and hit enter. Join this over here, and then I'm going to format lastly this one. So format, and I want it formatted to, again, the same way, commas where necessary, 0.2f, put a $sign in front of it this way, and break it somewhere here. Put a backslash before breaking it, and then I'm going to run this, and this should fix it. All right, so let's try when we are over budget first. So please enter how much you've budgeted for the month. I'm going to type in $1,000. Enter an expense. I'm going to enter 1,002. So my first expenses, I'm over already. I don't have any more expense. Actually, let me go ahead and I hit enter, so meaning I didn't type anything. So you were over your budget of $1,000 by $200. Okay, so it's correct. I just hit enter. I didn't type in yes, so it's the same thing over here. If I typed in 1,000 and I put 1,200, said yes, and I put in another 200, so I'm over by 400, and I hit no. I hit enter. It says you're over your budget of $1,000 by $400. Okay, and let's try under budget now. So $1,000 is my budget. I use 100, another 100, another 100, and then I was under budget by 700. So if I type no and hit enter, now you were under your budget of $1,000 by $700. Now let's try. I wasn't supposed to put a space here, but you can close a space. You can close a space, in there. By default, let's see. By default, or is it? So by default, you can put it instead of putting a $sign here, you can put it together with this. Okay, you can basically concatenate it with a string. So by default, because by default, I mentioned before, like by default, the argument you pass into the print function is separated by a space. That's why we are seeing, because this $sign is part of this. string, and there's a space before this is printed. The result or the return value of the format function here is printed. So we're supposed to put this $ with this instead. That's why there's a space. So let's do that, and then I'll test for this sorry sorry for the cough. This is under budget, and we'll test for the last one and see if it works. It should work. So I'm going to delete these $signs here, and delete this one. It's supposed to be with these ones. So the format function returns a string when it's done formatting. So you shouldn't have any problem concatenating a $sign, which is a string, to it like this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and copy and add it this way to this one, and add another one this way, this way. So now we are concatenating a $sign in front of the return value of this formatting. So now it should be good. So run this, type in $1,000, use $500 as my first expense. I have another expense, another $500. Now I have matched exactly my budget. So I hit enter, and I hit no more expenses. Hit enter, and it says you use exactly your budget of $1,000, and you can see that there's no more spaces, because now we've concatenated it to the form to this argument, which is the formatted version, or the formatted the formatted version of user budget. Okay, and if we can try just to test the other one, any of the other ones. 1,000, I use 100. I'm under budget, $900. When I hit no, you can see the $sign. Actually, the first $sign is close, but this one, where is it? Oh, over here. This is still on here. We have to go ahead and concatenate the other one. Concatenate the $sign to this one. Same for this one. And we can try just one last time, and it should work. So $1,000, $100. I was on the budget. If I hit no, I'm on the budget, $900. And now we can see the $sign is close to the values. Okay, so this program works. One more thing, if you wanted to separate, see the way everything is close together after you have more expenses. We can go ahead and separate the values. Separate the questions from the results. We can go ahead and type in a print function. Okay, now by default, when you type in a print function and you type in something, when I run this, and when I run this program, see, it's going to print what you told it to print. Okay, I told it to print this. It's going to print what you told it to print, and it's going to take the cursor to the next line. Okay, you can not the cursor, pretty much. It's going to you can say the right position. Basically, it's going to move the cursor to the next line. It's going to print anything that comes after this thing you've told it to print is going to print on the next line. So by default, the print function prints whatever you've told it to print, and it takes the cursor to the next line. So anything that comes after the print function is displayed on the next line. So what we can do, if you wanted to create an empty line before the output, is we can go ahead and call the print function by typing in nothing, or by printing nothing. So basically, you are printing, instead of printing this, you are printing nothing. But by default, the print function creates a new line. It takes the cursor to the next line. So anything that comes after the print function is going to be displayed on the next line. So it's going to print a new line, but anything that comes after that new line is going to be displayed on the next line. So it's going to create an empty line, basically, because you're printing nothing, and anything that comes after that empty line is displayed on the next line. So by calling the print function, we've created a space, or a new line. So if I run this, however, let's say another, let's say 10,000 this time around, and I use 5,000 and another $600, and I say no. Now it says, now we can see that we have the space here, you have the space, empty space here, and then we have the output. You were under your budget of $10,000 by 4,400. That's a way to just create a space. Or you can precede basically each of these print statements with a new line character, \n. Now the \n together, when the interpreter sees the \n together, it creates a new line character. So \n creates a new line character. You can precede each of these with a new line character. So before anything is printed, before it prints, it's going to create a new line, or it's going to take the killer to the next line, okay, and then print. If there's anything that comes after the new line character is printed on that next line. So this new line character creates a new line. You can do that. Precede each of these print statements with a new line character. But we've already called the print function, so it creates a new line before any of these is printed. Okay, so now we're done. Let's just test it one more time for maybe over budget. So I'm going to type in $10,000, and my first expense is going to be 10,000. Second expense is going to be 5,600. I have another expense. I'm going to type in yes. Type in another 5,600. I have no more expenses, so I'm going to type in no and hit enter. Now it says you were over your budget of $10,000 by $11,200. And we can even go ahead and say because you used, and then we can use the value stored in total expenses to display that. Okay. All right. So this program works. If you have any questions, please comment down below, and I'll do everything to respond to them. Thank you very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Have a good day. Have a nice time. Have a good night. Have a good sleep. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time with the next program. All right. Bye-bye.